Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the second album from Roux, titled Trouble in Paradise. You know, someday when pop culture historians sit down to write about the rise of EDM in the United States, they'd be wise to keep in mind two very important factors. The first is an admission that despite some of the genre's roots and coming from the disco and the club scenes in Detroit and Chicago, it wasn't exactly the United States that was responsible for turning EDM into the worldwide phenomenon that it is today. Now for that you need to give the majority of the credit to Europe, who'd been engaging this fluorescent explosion of pounding bass and gleaming synth lines in the mainstream for decades before rave and festival culture reappeared across the Atlantic. For me, the years that always struck out as the peak of said scene in the mainstream was the very late 80s and the early 90s, especially in England, with the moves to fuse all the baroque weirdness of synth pop with all stripes of dance music. It proved to be quite successful there with a number of high-charting acts. Now, the other factor, of course, is the club boom, an era from which approximately 2009 to 2012, where mainstream culture gravitated towards nightclubs thanks to a resurgence in synth pop and the success of mainstream hip-hop pushing that particular style and sound. Now, what tends to get glossed over in the story is that after several years of mainstream radio in the US basically ignoring European charts, the several synth-pop acts from other markets broke through around this time. Now, these are acts like Robin and Ellie Goulding, and the artist that we're going to be talking about today, Roux, who smashed onto mainstream radio in 2010 with Bulletproof, a song all hard-edged synths and a fiercely dynamic vocal performance from Ellie Jackson. Now, what made that album really stand out for me was the razor-edge balance between raw vulnerability and confidence that was mirrored in their instrumentation, and much sharper lyrics than you normally see in this particular brand of synth pop. In other words, Roux was the proto-Churches. And yet, after Bulletproof and worldwide tours, Roux pretty much dropped off the face of the earth. Ellie Jackson admitted that she wasn't really ready for the insane fame that comes with such a huge hit, and took a step back away from it, eventually parting ways with her longtime producing partner Ben Langmaid, but not before writing a few songs for the newest album, Trouble in Paradise, an album coming 5 years after their self-titled debut album and into a very different pop and dance music climate, especially in the mainstream. So I took a look at the record. How does it hold up? Well, it's good, but I'm not quite certain it's great or as sharply powerful as that self-titled debut. And for once, I can pinpoint the exact issue right out of the gate, which is kind of frustrating for me because if said issue had just been corrected in the studio, I'd probably be right along with the rest of the critics throwing a lot of critical acclaim at this record. Because that said, if you can look past that issue in the production, you'll find a lot to like in Roux's Trouble in Paradise across the board, which definitely manages to hold its own and even stand out in an increasingly crowded synth pop landscape today, which is impressive in its own right. So before we get to my big issue with this album, let's talk about everything that this album does right, which is it's a fair bit, it's a lot here. For starters, Ellie Jackson is an extremely strong vocalist who's capable of showing a lot of depth and complicated emotion through her vocal delivery, which really is demanded for the lyrical subject matter on this record. Now, I won't say that her vocal production is stellar or always places her best in the mix, we'll come back to this, but for the most part she's able to provide a lot of propulsive momentum to the album. And on that note, the lyrics and themes are pretty damn solid too, solidly sketching several situations where relationships are sabotaged or fracturing or breaking apart, which is a natural fit for a balance between sexually vivacious confidence and real vulnerability. Now, what gets interesting about this record is the juxtaposition in tone. Many of the songs are pretty upbeat, or at least have a pretty danceable synth-pop beat and atmosphere, but the subject matter tends to have undercurrents of bittersweet melancholy, such as the lonely Paradise Is You, the relationship imbalances and cruel sexuality, and the cheating of sex effect. Now, as much as I like the melody lines and how relentlessly catchy some of these songs are, the framing behind some of these songs does feel a little bit discordant, as they're songs about infidelity backed by instrumentation that's almost chipper. Now take for instance Kiss and Not Tell, a relentlessly upbeat and fun song with these gleaming upbeat synths and plucky guitar with a vibe of earnest anticipation about that particular hookup in question, but it's a song about forbidden love that seems to imply in the chorus that the guy in question is cheating, and it gets distracting. I mean, if you're saying kissing and not telling, who are you not telling in this case? It implies you're cheating here. Now, that's not saying that Roux doesn't occasionally get this balance right to some great effect. The sharp-edged metropolitan uptight downtown, the complicated yearning of Let Me Down Gently, and the dark, almost gothic smolder of Silent Partner, there's solid chunks of 80s inspired synth pop with a lot of punch and emotional power without ever really becoming a throwback. The highlight for me being Silent Partner, which reminded me a lot of mid-period Depeche Mode in a great way. And I really dug the antisocial vibe of that song, as she shoves away those who are encroach on her territory and emotions, who are unwelcome when she just wants to brood. And yet somehow the song never comes across as actively abrasive. That's a really tough balance to walk. It works great here. Now granted, most of this balance is a factor of the instrumentation, which much like the rest of the album is very reminiscent of the 1980s, and yet never really feels like a throwback. And like so much great 80s synth pop, it tends to work best when focusing on the killer melody lines and a solid, crisp mixed balance, which makes Let Me Down Gently and Silent Partner easily stand out as the clear highlights of the record for me. And yet the punchy beats of Uptight Downtown, the clipped disco-inspired guitar and bass, this languid, sandy feel of Paradise Is You, and even the pseudo-reggae vibe of Tropical Chancer with the clattering percussion and the tight synths, those are all pretty solid tracks. I really like them. Now the one true dud of this record is the closer, the hazy, stuttering track The Feeling, which pairs a really flat synth line with Jackson's falsetto range and some sloppy multi-tracking. It made to make the song really unlistenable. I just did not like it. But you know what? I've danced around this issue for too long, so let's talk about what knocks this record out of greatness for me: the production. Oh, don't get me wrong, it's not an issue on every single song on this album, but over half of this record, the mix balance on this record feels both clumsy, watery, and really neutering a lot of its impact. What made LaRoux's debut album work so well for me was its immediacy. For a synth pop record, every single melody glistened with hard edges and presence. It demanded, it forced you to listen, it demanded that attention. In contrast, most of Trouble in Paradise feels like those same synth melodies and guitars are being submerged in a puddle that never lets them really fully expand throughout the really expansive and deep mix without the benefit of actual reverb, which just comes across as a little bit chintzy to me. The exposed edges on the multi-track vocals and a little bit of distortion there does not help matters, especially when balanced against that damp, fluttery synth line on Kiss and Not Tell, or the real oiliness on Cruel Sexuality. And sure, now some of this might mimic some of the production of the past, but you don't need to do that here, because when you can improve upon it, and it occasionally makes some of the few of the tracks coming across as smaller, less impressive, and honestly just a little bit flat for me. They just did not work. But look, this is a production issue for me, and it might not prove as distracting for you as it did for me, because otherwise, Trouble in Paradise by LaRoux is pretty damn solid. Now, it's not perfect by any stretch of the mind, and I can't help but miss the more upfront style in her production, but the vocals are strong, the lyrics are solid, if not exactly nuanced, which you can get away with in synth pop, and the instrumentation has some really tight, really dynamic grooves. I'm thinking a 7 out of 10 for me, and I think it's a recommendation is appropriate for this. So if you're missing some tightly written synth pop, or you just found the overwhelming bombast of Strange Desire by Bleachers just a little bit too much, go ahead, check out Trouble in Paradise by LaRoux. And you know what? It's good to see her back. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out this year that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.